We've been talking recently about this idea that because of AI, to what extent will understanding grammar in one's own writing, particularly, how important is that going to be in the coming years? And then I was listening to this podcast. It's the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, and Bonnie Stachowiak was interviewing John Warner, who is quite possibly the biggest name in um, like composition theory in the United States. He's written all these amazing books and he's just really big. And so I found it really interesting to hear his take on this. And I'm just gonna play 3 or 4 minutes from this podcast and let you hear what she is thinking, and then how he responds.
But I love it so much when I can just focus on the writing and not worry about the correctness. I've had a student who I am fairly sure has dyslexia or something going on where they would spell words just entirely not correct. And I could have made the choice to say, you have to make every single thing that you are writing down perfect from a grammatical
Mhm.
spelling type of thing. And I don't know that I would have found myself in the same place. And again, I don't pretend to have the right answers. And some people I may be making really, really angry right now. But would you talk about kind of this tension between we want to cultivate writers and writing, and yet there is such a thing as something that is grammatically correct. So how are you
Sure.
thinking about those things?
Yeah, I mean the key I think is to realize that there is no easy answer to these questions, right? We're talking about a variable human process. And when we say writing, we have to recognize the context and occasion and purpose for a piece of writing varies incredibly, right? And so the values we may bring to a piece of writing will be very different depending on those factors, right? The tension of school is that we have to grade these things in some way. We have to say, is this worthy of whatever score that we have decided to use on something? And the correctness of something is a very easy, and when I say easy, not like easy, like simple to grade, but convenient. It's obvious, it's apparent, right? And so we often let these apparent criteria stand in for more meaningful criteria. One of the just general recommendations I make around assigning writing and assessing writing, and in some ways this is easier for writing teachers because I can say things like, in this experience, where I don't care if you're going to prove to me sort of mastery of subject knowledge because I'm teaching history or political science or criminology or what have you. I can just say, I want you to have an experience that reveals to me that you're developing as a writer. I can get away with that. That's harder in other subjects. But we can think about the values that attach to the artifact we're asking students to produce. So one of the things I joke about when I go and talk about this stuff in audiences is how when we look at a piece of writing in the world and we think it's good, we don't praise it for things like it having 5 paragraphs or having the thesis at the bottom of the first paragraph or never using a contraction or not using a first person pronouns or that kind of all these things that students are forbidden from doing for the purposes of writing a school essay. That's not how we respond to these things as an audience. And so if we're going to ask students to produce written artifacts, we must first, I think, look at them from the standpoint of audience. What is this thing for? Who is it for? What is its purpose? What is its message? Who is its audience? The rhetorical situation. And then assess them according to those criteria and those values. And so if correctness is important in that context, we can still value correctness. We're going to value correctness because it's important in that context, not just because correct is better in because we're in school. And I bring this stuff to my different work all the time. I write a column for the Chicago Tribune. I write a blog for Inside Higher Ed, and I write my own personal newsletter every week. The Chicago Tribune column and the Inside Higher Ed blog have copy editors who go in and fix my mistakes. My newsletter does not. And there are mistakes in my newsletter every week because proofreading is not a strength. But mostly because my audience doesn't care, because the expectation for that medium is different than a column in a newspaper, right? And so we can be thoughtful about how we assess these things depending on what we want students to demonstrate to us in terms of their thinking, in terms of their learning. So if it's something a student is writing for a teacher to demonstrate knowledge and engagement or depth of engagement, we can maybe say maybe correctness isn't necessarily the thing that I care about now, as long as I can see evidence of depth. We can set the thermostat differently for these things. Like, oh, I don't care about absolute correctness, but I don't understand. I can't quite grasp what they're saying, so I need to move that up a couple of notches before they're there. And it's just a problem to be solved over and over and over again because there is no solution. I think of teaching that way. Teaching is just sort of iterative attempts at getting students engaged in learning, and it's a moving target all the time. The students of today, particularly after the pandemic, are not the students of 5, 6 years ago. We have to just recognize the reality of the conditions on the ground and do our best. And part of that is also giving ourselves grace to recognize there are no answers to these things, that it is going to be a process.
The thing that I found particularly interesting, I mean, everything he just said was fascinating to me, but when he talked about how in his own personal blog, which I'm sure a ton of people follow him, he does not spend much time editing and he just leaves the mistakes because he knows his audience isn't going to care. And his audience, just to remind you, like his thing is writing, and I'm sure most of the people who follow him are people who teach writing, and he's saying that group of people doesn't care that much about an extremely high level of perfection. I think that's just something that it's just disappearing with time. And you might be sad about that. You might be thrilled about that. However you feel, it's happening. And I'm just not sure how much longer we need to hold such a tight grip on grammar and grammar perfection because it is so, so rare anymore that it would matter. As long as your students know how to, have Grammarly or, some kind of app make their writing, up to snuff before they hand it in, that's the main thing they need to know at this point. I'm not saying no grammar at all, but I mean, and especially how we speak. If when you're using academic English or professional English in the workplace, that's going to make a huge difference to whether or not you're hired, promoted, have power. So that's a different thing. But in terms of writing, I think we can kind of start to let it go a little.